When you first start gardening, you are stoked to get anything to harvest. A little sprig of basil is a huge success, but as the years go on, take a look at my annual vegetable patch. I'm going to have to replace all of this next season, clear it all out, and it's a lot of work. And it's part of the fun, but sometimes you want things to be a little bit easier. So in this video, myself, Josh, Stephanie, and a special guest are going to give you some perennial vegetables that you can plant once and harvest for years. Let's kick it off with an absolute beaut, a tank of a perennial here in my backyard garden. I'm talking about asparagus. This is a plant that can easily grow for 15 to 20, maybe even 30 years. And it's not really one plant that you're dealing with. You want to plant out a bunch of them in a patch and let that patch mature over the years. So the beauty of asparagus is that it can be planted all the way from zone 2 up to the tropic. So it's a true all-climate perennial, which is just an amazing, amazing gift. But what you see here is the mature stage when they're actually growing out. These are called asparagus ferns, and beneath, a couple years ago, I planted what are called asparagus crowns. 3 different ways you can plant asparagus, but the beauty is patience. It takes a couple of years for asparagus to establish itself. Those crowns are going to start developing energy, and they'll throw up a couple of asparagus spears even in that first year. But if you harvest those, you'll be taking the powerhouse of the asparagus off too early in the season or too early in its life cycle. So what you want to do is, the first couple of years, maybe take 1 spear if you just absolutely can't wait. But leave all those spears to develop these ferns, which are sucking up a ton of energy from the sun, water, nutrients, and fertilizer, and developing that underground structure. So that on year 3 and beyond, all the way till maybe year 30, you can harvest an abundant amount of spears. This is one of those plants that once it's established, you will never want for asparagus again in your life. This perennial plant is right before me, and it is one that most people say, I can't grow where I live, and that is not true. You can see it off right here, and this is of course rhubarb, also known as the pie plant. Now the cool thing about rhubarb as a perennial is that it usually grows in very cold zones. That's why I said I usually am told I can't grow it here. And that is why I chose a specific variety called Victoria. It is a type of rhubarb that can handle the heat, does well in a more wide variety of climates. It is greener than some of the standard classic rhubarbs that are usually that really cool deep red color, but the taste is still really quite delicious. Now a couple of tips for growing rhubarb. You could expect this to live for basically 10 years. It does not like the heat, as I alluded to, hence why I'm in such a tight area of my garden, because I planted it behind my fruit trees and my Mexican sunflower here so they would get shaded from the intense sun heat. Now speaking of harvesting, how do you harvest this plant? The best way to do it is actually not with like a pruner or a knife, but instead you just want to go ahead, come down to the base of the plant, grab it really near, and then pull it to the side. If you pull it to the side, you'll get that entire stalk releasing without damaging the plant. The next thing I like to do is just get a knife out and I'll trim off this top leaf. The top leaf itself actually has a ton of oxalic acid, which is really hard on your digestion to the point where most people would consider it toxic. This is the part of the plant you actually want to eat. This is the rhubarb stalk. What I like to do is cut it up into little chunks, put it in a freezer bag, keep it in the freezer until I have enough to make a pie. And that's all there is to it. It will just grow on its own. It'll come back every single year. My favorite perennial plants in my garden are my fruit trees. Now, when I first started container gardening, I thought I was going to be much more limited in what I could grow than I actually turned out to be. So as long as I get the right types of plants, I can have my own mini orchard on my rooftop deck garden. So I have 4 different fruit trees so far. I'll probably add more soon, and as long as I get varieties that are either compact or grow more vertically than they do wide, they fit perfectly in my garden. So I have here a miniature peach tree. This one is year 1 in my garden. I haven't had it fruit yet. Then I have 2 columnar apple trees. So these are fantastic because they are going to stay so narrow and just keep getting taller. If you want to grow apple trees, you do need 2 different varieties so they can cross-pollinate. I actually got these 2 together in a kit. It's the second year for these in my garden, and I got 3 apples this year, which is very exciting. The first time I've grown my own apples. And then lastly, I have a Chicago hardy fig. This is also the first year in my garden for it, but I've had at least 2 figs off of it already, and there's another one growing on it right now. So far these have been pretty low maintenance for me, which is very nice. Now they are on the smaller side still, so I'm keeping them in smaller containers and then just upsizing them slightly each season as they continue to grow. But right now, they're still really easy for me to move around in these smaller pots. At some point, I'll probably end up growing these in like 20-inch diameter pots once they hit their full size, and it might be a little bit harder to maneuver them around the deck, but these have just been so much fun to grow. All of these fruit trees do want full sun, at least 6 to 8 hours a day. And because they're in full sun and in relatively small pots, I do have to water them around once a day when we are in the hottest part of the garden season. Since I'm watering so often and they are in pots, I also do fertilize more than I would if they were growing in the ground. So I just use a general all-purpose fertilizer about once every 6 weeks on all of these, and that's worked really great. Now, for overwintering, very important, so I'm currently in a zone 6A, but if you're growing in containers and you want to leave plants out over the winter, make sure you go at least 2 zones colder than your current zone. So I would want to make sure that these plants are at least a zone 4A, or else I need to store them somewhere that's a little bit more protected to keep them alive during the winter, especially when they are smaller. So if you are growing on a deck or all in containers, know that you can also create your own mini orchard. I am now standing amongst one of my favorite perennial plants that Kevin trash talks all the time. I don't know what his deal is against it. You guys should ask him, because he's been very mean about it. And that is my tree collard, aka tree kale, aka walking stick kale. It has many names. This is a perennial leafy green that produces kale or collard-like leaves, depending on what you feel like calling them, and it is actually quite tasty. Now here's the thing. In the summertime, not that great, but neither is any of my other kale. They tend to be more bitter and tough. But come winter, come spring, when it's nice and cool, this makes sweet, nutty, big, giant kale leaves that are wonderful in soups. They're wonderful even raw. They're not as stringy as most kales. I don't know why people don't grow more of it, honestly. It's probably because it's really hard to find. This thing can live for up to 10 years. But the deal is, I've had this in the garden now for about 4 years. It's only produced seed a single time. Most people only get it through plant propagation through cutting, and that is honestly the way I would go about it. If I were to propagate this, I could do it either through a couple of different ways. I could wait and try to get lucky to see if it produces seeds, but my personal preference is to take a knife and cut it only where it's the most tender, where it wants to break very easily. Remove every single one of these leaves, and then you put this in a nice wet pot of soil, and it should be able to develop roots. I've actually done that a couple of times and transplanted that around my garden. But in the end, I still only come back to this one because this one plant is producing at least 20 different side shoots, and all of them are producing tons of kale. So if you want something that's long-lived, produces really delicious greens, I would highly encourage you to keep your eye out for tree collard or tree kale, whatever the name is in your area, because it is quite tasty and it is entirely carefree.